Glorious greetings to everybody. I'm Brian Bediger, Executive Director of Wide Horizon in beautiful Colorado. And we're so grateful that you've all joined us here today for Wide Horizon Presents the Vital Role of Testimonies in the Christian Science Church, Blessing the Public. Before we get started, I'd like to also introduce Norm Williams. Norm is the Director of Development and Outreach at Wide Horizon, and we're so grateful that he coordinated this event with Joan and Gabriel, and we're grateful for that. Gabriel Serafini of Serafini Studios is our technical support and handling everything behind the scenes and up front as well. I'm so grateful to be able to introduce Dr. Joan Bernard Bradley, who has become a friend over the last year and a half of our work together in a different organization. She is here to present this wonderful workshop about the evolution of the Wednesday evening testimony meetings. Dr. Bradley has presented this workshop in England and Canada and throughout the United States. It's always enthusiastically received from what I've heard. Her research was done at the Mary Baker Eddy Library and the Longyear Museum. And when Joan was introduced to Christian Science, the testimonies she heard at the Wednesday evening meetings inspired her to become a serious student of Christian Science. During that time, her son was subsequently healed of asthma, a condition that had gone on for years. And just as a side note, that was one of my pivotal healings in Christian Science as well.
Really?
I had that healing at 18 years old and had gone from somebody who didn't run and loved to run to somebody who was a long distance runner and basketball player. Joan is also a former school principal and a professor of education. Her doctorate is in educational leadership and administration. She has contributed a number of articles to the Christian Science periodicals, and I think you'll all really enjoy this. So now, the Zoom be with you, Joan.
Yes. Thank you, Brian, for that warm introduction. I'm most grateful for the opportunity to share my research. You know, I often get asked why I do this. And you've heard the introduction. My son was healed of asthma. But the pivotal point for me when I first started studying Christian Science was the testimony meetings. They spoke to me, they resonated with me. And it was a very small society in Freeport, Bahamas. And what was remarkable was every Wednesday night, that those members got on their feet and they were testifying of the power of God to heal whatever was presenting itself in the human experience. And as I sat and as I listened, I thought, geez, that sounds like something I could learn, because I had a few challenges back then. And as I did, the healings came. And so I can understand why our leader emphasized the importance of giving testimonies within those meetings, both to bless ourselves, but especially to bless the public. So the development of the meetings was 1882 to 1900, 18 years. And it occurred to me that 18 is the legal age when one becomes an adult. And so I thought, wow, it took Mary Baker Eddy 18 years to nurture this idea to fruition. But what I'd like you to think about today, hold this analogy in thought. Think about what it's like to raise a child during 18 years. It's a time of great learning for everyone. It's a time of learning new vocabulary, new behavior. It's a time of change and adaptation. It's a time when there's conflict, and there's triumph. And so as we work through the history today, you'll see that all those elements are involved in this unfoldment of this idea. And then it occurred to me that it took a full 18 years because what was happening was that it was a reform in Christian worship. no such thing existed as having testimonies being shared about God's power to heal. And so there are two significant reforms in Christian worship. And the first one is a testimony meeting. We'll talk about the other one later on as we progress. So, how is history valuable to us? Here's what I'm hoping you will do. I hope you will notice the spirit with which these early workers carried out their tasks. Please consider, reflect on the concepts, even after the workshop is over. And I hope you will act on the information that is shared. So here's the timeline of the midweek meetings. And they were free, all Christian churches had a midweek meeting. So this Christian Science denomination also referred to it frequently as a midweek meeting. So in 82, that was the earliest record of organized activity. And they were called Parlor lectures. Now, a Victorian parlor is the equivalent of a modern living room. So generally they were small and intimate. And they were held initially on Thursday afternoons at 3 o'clock. Then in 87, they were held on Thursday evenings. And then in 88, there was a different day, Friday evenings. Notice in the changes. Well, lots of changes are going to happen here as it's evolving. So in 88, one of the biographers state that there were not yet demonstration meetings. In other words, testimonies were not being given. The content was essentially just a discussion of the scriptures. Notice my blue line. For fun, I've called that the line of demarcation, because starting in 89, lots of changes start to occur. You start to see a name change, public meetings. Mayor Baker Eddy made it very clear that the purpose of the meeting was to focus on sharing with the public. And here's some new vocabulary that's starting to occur. Now, Mrs. Eddy tells them they are to relate their experiences of healing. That was the order of service. Later that year, they're called praise services. Can you see how the purpose is being clarified? The priorities of the meeting is unfolding. And in the journal of that year, the term personal demonstration appears. So everyone's learning that part of participating meant sharing their personal demonstrations. This was a very new concept. Then in 1895, Eddy referred to them simply as experience meetings. That's pretty clear, isn't it, what the purpose is? And then in 1898, she names them Wednesday meeting. Now, notice I've highlighted 1895 and 1898, because 1895, I'm sure you all recognize that date, the original Mother Church was complete. And we had the inauguration of the impersonal pastor. So that was another reform in Christian worship. And then it wasn't until 1898, 3 years later, that the idea of how the Wednesday evening meeting should be structured was unfolded to our leader. So it took her 3 years of prayer. So what a wonderful example this is for us. We can be patiently praying. She did for 3 years. And then in 1900, the order of service was published in the manual. And item number 6, I encourage you to look at that. She made provision. Time is set aside for experiences, testimonies, and remarks on Christian Science to be shared. So that's it. That's the structure of the midweek meeting. So it's 1882, and the 3rd edition of Science and Health has been published. This is a special edition because for the very first time, the cross and crown appears on the cover. And it announces to the world what the mission of this book is. Now, notice that the cross and crown is different from the one we have today. This symbol is called the coronet, and it was worn by princes. It had no religious significance. It was later changed to the celestial crown, which was worn by kings, and that had religious significance. So just read with me, please, the details on the cross and crown. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons. So here she is publishing for mankind what her mission is. So what does she want to do with this book? She wants to share it with humanity. Inside this book is what she describes as her scientific method of healing. And at this point, you'll notice going forward that because it's a research-based presentation, the citations, the excerpts from the different sources are in quotes, and I've invited both Brian and Norm to help me narrate the history of the development of the meetings. So Brian, would you please?
For 3 years after my discovery, I sought the solution of this problem of mind healing. I knew the principle of all harmonious mind action to be God, and that cures were produced in primitive Christian healing by holy, uplifting faith. But I must know the science of this healing, and I won my way to absolute conclusions through divine revelation, reason, and demonstration.
And that's from Science and Health, page 109. And I love where she says she discovered the science and she won her way. It was a demonstration for her leader. And this was the method that she practiced and she taught her students how to heal effectively through revelation, reason, and demonstration. So it's 1882. Does anyone recognize the individual who's photographed? Of course you do. She's Queen Victoria. It's a Victorian era, which means that probably the greatest challenge for Mary Baker Eddy was there were no modern methods of communication to get the word out in large scale. There were no telephones, no computers, no television sets. But because of her effective work, the newspapers were starting to cover the work that she was doing in the community. The first, as I mentioned earlier, the first organized record were Parlor lectures in 1882. We know they were held weekly, Thursday afternoons. Mary Baker Eddy referred to them as practical metaphysics. They were held at the Metaphysical College in Boston, which was also her home. Lectures cost 25 cents. The equivalent in today's money would be about $6.50. But they were cheaper than buying a book because the cost of paper back then was prohibitive. And so for many people, they invested in the lecture and then they would decide if they would buy a book. The lectures were extremely successful. So successful that in 1883, that small church was able to start what was called the Journal of Christian Science. And the journal advertised public lectures, free to all. And the source for this information is from an article in the Sentinel by Judy Hanna, who is the senior archivist at the Mary Baker Eddy Library. Now, the concept of free was very important because religious activity, church services, one had to rent a spot in a pew. So they were not free, really. They were available to those who could afford it. And so they were not public. So the concept of having these lectures available to the public was very important to Mary Baker Eddy. Now, Haneke, in her article, pointed out astutely that the success of the lecture format influenced the design of the Wednesday evening meetings as we have them today. So let me explain. You notice back then you had a single speaker. Today we have a single reader. Eddie expected and encouraged attendees to actively participate. After the lecture was given, they were encouraged to ask questions, make remarks, and spontaneously share their ideas. The effect of this active participation was that the lectures were engaging and inspiring and stimulating. And so we see that Mary Baker Eddy maintained this idea of active participation. You know, it's a standard. It's an organizational value that she encouraged and expected time set aside to do that. So it's October 87. Meetings are now being held in the evenings at Tremont Temple. And we've all read about Tremont Temple in the biographies. Now, why did they move? Well, although she liked having the meetings in her home, once they began to start to feel like it was a church activity, they started to sing hymns. And Eddie's neighbors were not going to have any of that. So they complained. So the solution was to have members who lived close by take turns holding the meetings. And that worked for a while until October 86. We started to have a revolt. There were 26 students who started to revolt against Eddie and the church, and they were eventually expelled from the church. But what that meant was, with those 26 members gone, there weren't enough homes to host the meetings. So the church was forced to move and rent a space. And Christian Science was not mainstream. It was not welcome. One of the few places that were willing to host these meetings, to rent to them, was Tremont Temple, that organization. They were their own religious organization. So it was strictly a business arrangement because the ministers of Tremont Temple despised Christian Science and they actively preached against it. So you can see the conflict here, not only conflict with the students who had revolted, but conflict from the ministers at Tremont Temple. It's worth noting that in 87, Mary Baker Eddy wrote Feed My Sheep. And as I was studying this poem within the context of the time, it occurred to me how often she used the word how 4 times in that first verse. And that just gave me a sense of the depth of her prayer and an appreciation for the depth of her prayer.
Shepherd, show me how to go o'er the hillside steep, how to gather, how to sow, how to feed thy sheep. I will listen for thy voice, lest my footsteps stray. I will follow and rejoice all the rugged way.
And it's worth noting that the melody for hymn 306 was written by William Lyman Johnson. And it's just fun when you're selecting that hymn, just to think about the history and the context that led to the development of that hymn. Remember, I pointed out that at this point, there were not yet demonstration meetings. Well, let's hear what Johnson has to say.
Friday evening services were sometimes conducted by Mrs. Eddy, but more frequently by her students. They were not demonstration meetings, as we now use the phrase, but more like those of other churches, with the business of the meeting being transacted, followed by discussion of the scriptures.
So, like all Christian churches, they use the International Bible Lessons as a basis for discussing the scriptures. That was the activity, that was the interaction, mere discussion, as opposed to later testifying. And of course, the lecture, again, would be part of the main business of the meeting. Very soon, they're starting to outgrow the space.
Friday meetings were very simple. They were carried on in a quiet, unpretentious way, but as the number of attendants increased, the room became crowded, and it was necessary that another place for the meetings be procured.
So we see they're making their demonstration that expectation is followed by results.
The church family was small. They all knew each other, and there was a dominant desire to help in any way possible, time and energy not being considered when they were expended for the cause.
Yes, and I love how Johnson communicates. Remember, he's an adult now, he's writing, he's saying, he's sharing what he saw, what he noticed as a boy growing up. And he noticed there was this dominant desire, this spirit to help whatever was needed to serve the cause of Christian Science. The early workers were willing to do. Now, in this section, we're going to talk about how they carried out the mission of church. So we're going to start with community outreach. And what's significant here, some of these activities are ones we are involved today in our demonstration of church.
With these people, Christian Science was their all in all, for there were few that had not been brought out of great tribulation by it. They had made sacrifices, had been maligned, scorned, and laughed at. Attempts had been made to undermine not only their individual work, but that of the whole cause. And they had gone from door to door, canvassing for subscriptions for the journal.
Don't you just love that spirit of commitment, that love, willing to go door to door, despite the aggressive behavior by the students who had revolted? They were on a campaign to discredit the movement, but they were committed to supporting the growth of Christian Science. They had been brought out of great tribulation. They were Christian Scientists because they were healed. Literature distribution.
2 faithful workers obtained permission to place in the waiting room of the Union Depot a box containing Christian Science literature. Some 400 pamphlets, journals, etc., found their way into the hands of the public every month.
Again, in an in-person meeting, somebody called out 400 pamphlets? That sounds like a full-time job. Well, it tells you about their level of commitment. And the Union Depot was the hub of transportation in Boston. So it was important that Christian Science literature be there available for the public. And they did this every month. Making healing available to the public.
A free dispensary was opened during the Easter week, 1889, for those unable to pay for healing or prevented by their circumstances from hearing the glad tidings, unless taken to them by messengers of the truth.
Now, a medical dispensary would be a public clinic available to those who could not afford to pay for their own medical care. And when the Christian Scientists saw and knew of this activity, they wanted to express their own generosity and care. And so they offered what would have been called a metaphysical dispensary, where those who were unable to pay for healing could come for treatment and receive what they called the glad tidings. But I also love thinking about how they refer to themselves. They thought of themselves as messengers of the truth. And I'm going to invite you just to think for a moment about this concept of what it meant to these workers to be messengers of the truth. So we're at the end of the 80s, and there is unexpected change.
By the end of the 1880s, it appears that the Friday evening meetings had evolved almost unnoticed into what was called students' meetings. It appears meetings were now more intended for private discussion among the Boston Christian Scientists than for those looking to explore the science of Christ.
Now, that's not what Mary Baker Eddy intended. Students' meetings means the focus was on their needs as Christian Scientists. They were having private discussions and not thinking about the public. Here's another reason.
The Christian Science Church was now developing its own study notes from a Christian Science perspective, with greater references to Mrs. Eddy's writings. So the midweek meetings were evolving into Bible study groups and were no longer focused on sharing personal experiences.
The study notes would be the early beginnings of what we now have as a Christian Science Quarterly. So you could see there's a desire to really dig deeper and to think about the Bible from the standpoint of Christian Science. So essentially then, those midweek meetings were Bible study groups, okay, as opposed to sharing personal experiences, okay? Not what our leader intended. So she heard about this from her loyal followers. They kept her abreast of what was going on in Boston. And when she heard about it, she fired off a desk notice to be read at the Easter service. And it's entitled, A New Departure.
The regular Friday evening meetings of the church are changed into public meetings at Steinert Hall and will consist of an address, relation of experiences, and discussion on inquiries from the audience.
This is a directive. It's to be implemented. And here she names the meetings, they're public meetings. Steinert Hall is one of the halls at the Hotel Boylston. And she also indicates the order of service. It must consist of an address, a relation of experiences, and a discussion on inquiries from the audience. Now, who might the audience be? The public. So if there's going to be a discussion, it should be in answer to questions from the public. She was so focused on sharing with the public. So certainly there was an expectation that the public would be present at those meetings. So now, the editor, who I'm sure you all know, Judge Septimus Hanna, he plays a crucial role because remember, Mrs. Eddy's in Concord, and his job is to communicate to the members in such a way that they would respond to our leaders' requests. In fact, his role has been so crucial, it's been described by Gottschalk, which is one of her biographers, as making a distinguished contribution to the Christian Science movement. Judge Hanna had two significant roles. He was editor of the journal from 1892 to 1902, and he was also, at the same time, first reader from 1895 to 1902. overlapping roles. That ended in 1902 when Mary Baker Eddy wrote a manual bylaw. But you can see why his contribution to the movement is so loved and respected. So here's how the editor communicates. And what I'd like you to do, as this is being narrated, listen to the tone that he uses to communicate. Notice the vocabulary that he chooses.
The journal of this month is only a foretaste, a prophecy of what it will be when all scientists shall feel it a privilege and a joy to bring forth from the storehouse of experience things new and old, which will feed the lambs and one another. Open these precious stores and impart to others that which has enriched and built up your own spiritual life.
Isn't there a sense of nurturing love for the members? He says, it's a privilege and a joy to bring forth from the storehouse of your experience what you've experienced, with which to feed the lambs, the public, but also one another. And he lovingly encourages them to open their precious stores and impart to others what has enriched and built up their own spiritual life. It was testimonies that led to the growth of the Christian Science movement.
It was the lives of these early Christian scientists, their healing work, and the effect of their testimonies of healing that was largely responsible for the enormous growth of the movement beginning in the last decade of the 19th century.
Yes, that's pretty clear. That's what the public responded to. So, this is January 6th, 1895. We've covered 13 years of history so far. So 13 years later, here we have a photo of the Boston Herald. We all know what happened January 6th. The first Christian Science service has been held in the Mother Church, and they're reporting on the events. And 6,000 people show up in Boston for the services. To make it easier to read, here's what the Boston Herald wrote.
With simple ceremonies, 4 times repeated, in the presence of 4 different congregations, aggregating nearly 6,000 persons, the unique and costly edifice erected as a home for the first Church of Christ scientist and a testimonial to the discoverer and founder of Christian Science, Reverend Mary Baker Eddy, was yesterday dedicated to the worship of God.
So in order to accommodate the 6,000 people, the service was repeated 4 times. And it's beautiful to see how the Boston Herald acknowledged that the tremendous outpouring that happened at that service was a testimonial to the work of Mary Baker Eddy as discoverer and founder of Christian Science. Remember, Mary Baker Eddy is in Concord. She did not attend the dedicatory service, but she's kept informed by her loyal supporters. Now remember, the church is at the height of its prosperity. 6,000 people. It's a glorious time. Mrs. Eddy sends another desk notice to the editor and the reader that is to be read at the next Friday evening meeting. Here's what she has to say.
My dear students, make broader your bounds for blessing the people. Have Friday evening meetings to benefit the people. Learn to forget what you should not remember vis-a-vis self, and live for the good you do. Conduct your meetings by repeating and demonstrating practical Christian science. Tell what this science does for yourself and will do for others. Speak from experience of its founder, noting her self-sacrifice as the way in Christian Science. Be meek. Let your mottos for this meeting be, who shall be least and servant, and little children love one another.
Now this notice is available in different forms, but an easy way to get to it is the We Knew Mary Baker Eddy, the expanded edition, volume 2, and it's in Judge Hanna's memoirs. So I highly recommend that you look that up. But there's a lot here, so let's break it into sections. So the first paragraph, she makes these 2 points. Make broader your bounds for blessing the people. Have Friday evening meetings to benefit the people. What is she saying to her members? Despite the prosperity, isn't she clarifying keeping people focused on the purpose? Okay, broaden your bounds, bless the people, benefit the people. She just laser focused on blessing the public. So it's April of 1895. And guess what? The editor gets to communicate again. And here's what he wrote.
A change has been made in the manner of conducting the Friday evening meetings here in Boston. Instead of continuing to discuss the Bible lesson as formerly, meetings in the nature of experience meetings are held. A message from our leader curated these meetings.
This is a very important slide. Notice the reader. He immediately implements the change in the Boston church. He says, a change has been made in the manner of conducting the Friday evening meetings here in Boston. And then he explains that instead of continuing to discuss the Bible lesson during the meetings, these meetings will now be experience meetings. And he cites our leader as the authority for inaugurating these changes. He gets it. He understands our leader's purpose. But it's important to note that discussions of the Bible lesson within the meetings themselves have ended. The meetings are now named, at this point, experience meetings. And remember that item number 6, this is all unfolding for her, where that's the purpose, that as members, our job is to communicate and share your experiences of healing. So there we have it, what we've learned from the early workers, their experience led by our leader. And I'd just like to invite you, if you have any questions or comments, please go to my website, it's my name, and I'd be happy to respond. And I'd like, on behalf of Wide Horizon and the 3 other gentlemen who were involved in this, I'd like to say a great big thank you to each of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joan, very much.